Powerlifters make a lot of mistakes when it comes to progression in programs. Problem is that the average lifter will just blindly progress all of the sets in all of the sessions. Now, most lifters will think if you don't make progression in all the sets, you don't maximize the progressive overload. It turns out that this may be a bad idea because this may lead to poor fatigue management. Nowadays, most lifters will have some form of a top set and back off sets. But here's the interesting thing. You only need to make progression in one of the sets to actually create progression in the whole session. But the question is, should you progress the top set or the back off set? Now, if you're new here, my name is Norman Chong and I've been coaching powerlifting for over 13 years and I've helped lifters across the world to compete internationally. So in this video, I'll answer the following questions. How your choice of progression affects stimulus and fatigue across a training block? What are the pros and cons of progressing top sets, back off sets, or both? And which progression strategy works best for the different situations? But before we answer these questions, we need to understand what we are doing when we are prescribing top sets and back off sets and why we use progression through a program in the first place. Firstly, when we are prescribing a session consisting of a top set and a back off set, we are essentially creating two different intensity zones within the same training session. Now, the top set typically operates at a higher intensity, closer to your true maximum capability of that day in terms of absolute load. There are many reasons why we may prescribe top sets in the first place. Reasons can include providing some sort of exposure towards specificity so we can practice our skill at the top end. Another reason is the inherent need for exposure to a certain threshold of intensity to drive strength adaptations. Top sets can also potentiate performance in the following working sets. And finally, they can act as an indicator set to give both the coach and athlete a sense of where strength currently is. Back off sets, on the other hand, are performed at a reduced intensity. Sometimes they are prescribed at a percentage of a fixed value, percentage reduction from the top set, or with its own RP prescription. Now, these back off sets provide further stimulus through accumulating volume with a managed fatigue cost. Both top set and back off set have the same ultimate purpose to get you stronger. This is important because so many coaches and lifters often think that there is this massively discrete difference between the purpose of the top set and a back off set. Now, the act of using progression through the program is to create a systematic increase in training stress over a period of time. However, why we use progression in training stimulus is probably one of the most misunderstood aspects of programming for powerlifting. So if we actually understand why we use progression, or should use progression even, it will put us in a better position to program better. So then why do we use progression then? Most people will just say because of progressive overload. Well, this isn't exactly wrong, but it's not exactly right either, and I'll explain why. Now, when it comes to training stimulus, the absolute weight that you perform is obviously a part of this training stimulus. An important thing to remember is this: lifting more weight in a current training session is a consequence of previous overload, not necessarily the need for future overload. A more useful way to conceptualize training stimulus is thinking about the reps and the equivalent intensity that you are working at. If you train with any of these two variables being too high, you create too much fatigue, and if you do too little, you end up detraining. So when we are thinking about progression of the training stimulus, this is fundamentally what we are actually thinking about, the volume and the intensity. But then what about progressing the absolute weight? Now, people often think about progression options with sets, reps, RP, percentage, load, etc. But actually, when it comes to absolute weight, whatever relative intensity you end up performing with the weight at their given sets and reps, you are still imposing an equivalent intensity of 1 rep max for that day. If we design a training week and then we repeated it for several weeks, it is entirely possible that it was sufficient to put the lifter in a state of overload for over that period of time. So even though that relative stimulus from week to week has not changed, because the environment of that microcycle is sufficient to cause overload the whole time, it means that progress can actually be made. The ultimate conclusion that I want you to take away from this is that you don't necessarily need progression for progress to occur in performance, if the nature of that training stimulus was sufficient enough to cause overload the whole period of time. So going back to the idea of progression, sometimes we may be in a state where the microcycle is insufficiently or is no longer stimulating, in which case progression is necessary for reaching a state of overload or progressive overload, respectively. So then outside of progressive overload, why else would we actually need to use progression? Well, depending on how you program for powerlifting across the year, it would be a combination of the following reasons. Reason one, you simply want to have progression in intensity, specifically top-end intensity, because you are simply peaking towards a competition. This is particularly useful if you were coming from a place of insufficient intensity to physically prepare lifters. Reason two, you could be using progression to assess the top-end threshold of volume and intensity or overall training stimulus. This is particularly relevant if you are designing new training for a new lifter that you're dealing with for the first time. Reason three is psychological engagement. Periodizing a progression stimulus so sessions get harder keeps lifters engaged to a certain extent. Even if the progression is modest, it provides tangible feedback that the lifter is utilizing their training potential. So let's move on to how your choice of progression affects stimulus and fatigue across a training block. So not all progressions are made the same, and depending on how you're progressing the sets influences the overall stimulus and even performance of the whole session. Whether you are progressing intensity in either the top set or back off set, the average intensity will increase in that whole session. If you progress the top set intensity, this will increase the peak intensity of that session, but also have consequential effects in the performance performance of the back offset, depending on how high you progress that top set to. So progressing the top set is particularly effective strategy when building towards a peak in a competition prep. It's also useful for lifters who need that higher end of intensity exposure in order for their top end strength to come through. If you've noticed that progressing back offsets doesn't seem to translate into improved top end performance, this approach is worth considering. One nuanced application is to progress the top set while simultaneously periodizing the back offset intensity downward. This stabilizes the overall training dose of that session and is particularly useful when peaking, as it prevents lifters from overshooting their peak. It works especially well when the top end intensity during the peak is higher than what they've been exposed to in the previous training blocks. When a session includes multiple back offsets, progressing only the top set can serve as a more conservative way to increase training stress across the week, since the bulk of the volume remains relatively stable. This approach becomes even more valuable when lifters need to improve their capacity or execution at the top end on a technical level. Whether the breakdown is mental or physiological, repeated exposure to heavier intensities gives them the practice they need. However, you do need to take into consideration the top end's intensity's effect on subsequent back offset performance, namely the fatigue. If you're using a wave-learning approach to periodization, progressing only the top set works well, provided you know the overall average intensity remains within the stimulating range. This also serves as a useful tool for lifters who need frequent exposure to a minimum threshold of top end intensity for practice. Some lifters simply cannot handle something like a triple at RPE6 without it affecting the rest of the session, but you still want them touching heavier loads regularly through the year. At the same time, keeping the back offset static in intensity means you've already identified their sweet spot for accumulating work. Finally, you might choose to progress the top set as a diagnostic tool to identify the threshold at which the top end intensity begins to compromise the work capacity for subsequent back offsets. This is simply the application of the process of finding your own data by finding the hard limits to these variables. There are no failures to program design, just data. So let's move on to actually considering progressing the back offsets instead. Now, progressing the back offsets can actually be more stressful and stimulating than progressing the top sets, depending on how many back offsets you are prescribing. The cumulative effect of driving intensity upward across multiple sets add up quickly. This approach is particularly useful when you want to keep the top end static in order to monitor the relative changes of performance from week to week. A fixed top set prescription gives you a consistent reference point, i.e. an apples to apples comparison. So you can observe changes in strength either from a fixed intensity prescription or RPE changes on a fixed load prescription, all without the confounding variable of a moving target. Progressive back offsets may also be the better choice for lifters who are particularly sensitive to top end intensity. Some lifters simply don't respond well to frequent increases in the heavy end, and pushing that lever too hard creates more fatigue than adaptation. For these lifters, driving progression through the back offsets instead allows you to increase overall training stress without overreaching their whole system. Now, if your back offsets use a different variation from the top set, progressing them makes sense when you want to specifically drive adaptations from the qualities of the back offset variation. In this case, the top end might serve to be a maintenance of exposure to skill and specificity, whilst the back offset variation does the heavy lifting for addressing the weaknesses. In some cases, you may only have the option to progress back offsets. This happens when you're working with someone who already requires that constant exposure to that high percentage top set, where there's little room for any progression at the top end. So the back offsets become the only viable lever available to manipulate. Similarly, your top set might already be sitting in a sweet spot, particularly on a secondary training day where it doesn't need any further progression. In this situation, the top set is doing its job by potentiating the back offsets. So you keep it stable and simply progress the back offsets to drive the whole session stimulus forward. Outside of progressing just the top set or the back offsets, there is also the option of progressing both sets. If your back offsets are prescribed at a percentage reduction from the top set, progressing both becomes straightforward. You simply progress the top set and the back offsets follow automatically. This keeps the relative relationships between them consistent, whilst the absolute intensity climbs across the week or block. Whether your back offsets are tied to the top set or prescribed independently, progressing both sets is likely going to be the most aggressive approach to increasing training stress. You can think of it as pushing two levers simultaneously, so the cumulative effect of fatigue and stimulus is greater than any individual strategy in isolation. Because of this, aggressive progressions on both sets can be reserved for specific situations. Lifters returning to training after a holiday or a deload or competition or even illness. More liberal progressions through progressing both sets can be a useful exploratory tool. So when you're designing training block for someone new, pushing both sets can help you gather hard data on the top end tolerance of training dose. This information becomes invaluable when it comes to calibrating and refining the training dose for future training blocks. So I hope you guys found that video useful. And as always, click like, subscribe, and I'll see you guys on the next one.